unfortunately not new, that we have captives, and Achenu is one of the references, but it's also in the Amidah. In the Amidah, refer to God as Metir Asurim, free of the hostages. It's in the morning blessings. It is nothing new. I think part of the crisis of this moment is we did hope. The hope, Hatikva, the hope was that the existence of the state of Israel would end that reality, and now we're seeing that it does not. But with that, I'm sharing.
Easier for you.
I'm sharing this.
You may recognize some.
This musical, yeah. We have, of course, Rabbi Bakter over here from Central Synagogue, and let's see their rendition of Achenu.
Achenu, kol beit Yisrael. Achenu, kol beit Yisrael. Hanetunim betzara, betzara uvashirya, haomdim ben hayam uven bayabasha. Achenu, kol beit Yisrael. Achenu, kol beit Yisrael. Hanetunim betzara, betzara uvashirya, haomdim ben hayam uven bayabasha. Hamakom yerachem, yerachem aleichem, v'yotzihem mitzara, lirvacha, u'me'afel ha'evora, u'mishirun yegula, ashta bagala, u'bizman karim. Hamakom yerachem, yerachem aleichem, v'yotzihem mitzara, lirvacha, u'me'afel ha'evora, u'mishirun yegula, ashta bagala, u'bizman karim.
Please rise, put your hand on your heart, and let us turn to our Israeli brothers and sisters and say, we remember you.
Ashta bagala, u'bizman karim.
I saw his. See, he's on the side.
Yeah. So
Take a look at this.
Yeah.
Uh, welcome.
In progress.
Let's-
So I'm going to ask everyone to mute themselves, please. But I think we did see something at the end that sort of corresponds to something we said last week, and it's going to be relevant today as well. We mentioned that the reform movement at its incept in America was anti-nationalist, was anti the idea of returning to a Jewish state. So one thing we saw there, and I think about you saying this, Rabbi Katzew, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Central Synagogue is one of the, I think the direction of prayer is not towards Israel. Do you know if I'm right?
Are you asking about the building architecture? Yes,
Yes.
you're correct. Yes.
which is why at the end they said turn towards Israel, towards the east. So this is how we see the change in the reform movement, that when this great synagogue was built, I'm not sure if purposefully, but at least they did not make sure to not to face towards Israel. I'm not sure if they made sure to face away from Israel, but yeah, but we see their dedication obviously now to Israel. And Johed has a comment. I think I know what you want to say, but go ahead.
What I was going to say is when WRT was built, the ark was not facing east, and when the renovation happened in 12 years ago, there was the decision was made to reorient the sanctuary.
Yeah.
Now that excellent, and as I think was mentioned last session as well, WRT stands for obviously Westchester Reformed Temple, and to call a house of worship a temple is already itself a statement about Zionism. Why is that? What does it mean if you call a Jewish house of worship a temple, whether it's the temple in Atlanta or Westchester Reformed Temple?
Well, the temple is in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
End of story.
Yes. And so as a consequence, it's making a statement that in some ways is a comment on what Isaac Mayer Wise, the founder and organizer of especially American Reform Judaism, said, America is our Zion. We're home. We're not looking for any other place. We're not yearning for any other place. We don't feel a profound inner connection to any other place. And that's consonant with the idea that I also referred to last time, that the Jews aren't a people. We are a religious community, a faith community. And what Noam absolutely adroitly and correctly pointed to is some of the reforms that have occurred in the reform movement over the course of the last 140 years. When I say 140 years, it was at 1885 explicitly that the rabbis of the reform movement in the United States got together and made a very principled statement that we're no longer a nation. And no longer yearning for a return of the temple, no longer looking for a home other than being at home, in this case, in the United States. And now, 140 years later, you have at a place like Central Synagogue, and also undoubtedly WRT and many, many other Reform congregations, taking people to Israel, relating to Israel in a very different way from our forebears in the Reform movement. Sandra, please. You need to unmute yourself.
What does it mean in the prayer service, which says, Tzur Yisrael, rise for Israel, and people stand up?
I love the question.
The question,
Noam is beaming, so no.
Yeah, because it's actually deeply related to the Declaration of Independence. A part of the declaration we would see more closely next week. But Tzur Israel literally means rock of Israel, or strength of Israel.
It means state of Israel?
No, strength.
Strength.
Tzur literally means rock.
Rock.
Yeah. So that part in the service, Tzur Israel, Kuma be'ezrat Israel, the rock of Israel, rise up to the help of Israel, and with your strength, redeem Israel. So we rise up partly because it has the word rise up there, and it's also related to the Amidah, the standing prayer that comes right after. And in the Talmud there is a passage saying that you need to connect tefillah, to connect the prayer of Amidah to the idea of redemption. So that's why we have the prayer for redemption right before that.
Right.
But the phrase Tzur Israel appears in the Declaration of Independence. We're going to see it next week. And we're also going to see that it's purposefully a little bit vague as to what is the strength of Israel.
Yes,
Thank you.
that's a wonderful key question that you've raised, because we're going to learn that there probably are as many opinions as there are those of us who are participating in this learning about what Sur Yisrael means, and we're allowed to have different understandings of what it means. But as Noam said, there is a long-standing tradition, for example, that if there's any one place in the whole service that you don't give announcements, that you don't have any break whatsoever, it's between the Tzur Yisrael and the Amidah. You are taught right from, if this was a yeshiva or you were a cheder, you would learn right from the beginning. This is what you have to do. This is part of the architecture almost of Jewish prayer, that you link inextricably the notion of redemption and the divine and the Amidah. Now, in the last session, we sort of used a wide-angle lens, if you will, to look at documents, at significant documents that led to and sort of undergirded the Declaration of Independence and the state of Israel. And in our preparation for this particular session, Noam and I discussed using a different lens altogether. In this case, a telephoto lens, to look at a couple of individuals from an individual perspective. What did some of these events, like the partition plan in 1947, or other elements, other dates and other events that are mentioned in the Declaration of Independence? Now, has any of you ever read a book by Amos Oz, or anything by Amos Oz, or is that name familiar to anyone? Aha. So I see Sandra. I don't know. So yes, good. So the reason that I mention him is we are going to look at a brief excerpt from something that Amos Oz wrote in what, for me, I admit, is arguably my favorite book that I have ever read. In Hebrew, it's Sipur al Ahava v'Choshech. In English, it's A Tale of Love and Darkness. And if you haven't read something by Amos Oz, I cannot more wholeheartedly recommend him. He was an extraordinary writer, now deceased. And in this passage that we're going to look at for a few minutes, the context is that he is writing about his family. He came from an illustrious family, a family of great writers and thinkers and lovers of the people of Israel, the land of Israel, and ultimately the state of Israel, but also liberalism as well as Judaism. And he is at this point relating to a very intimate conversation. Some of it is with words and some of it is without words. And I'm going to ask you, if you're comfortable, a question that may be quite revealing, and I'm prepared to respond to it as well, because he's going to refer to a singular event in his life, the only time that he experienced his father crying. But my father said to me, as we wandered there on the night of November 29th, 1947, that was the night of the partition plan being passed at the United Nations, me riding on his shoulders, so he's a young boy, among the rings of dancers and merrymakers. And if you can just go down to the picture, to the image right below, thank you. I mean, look at this. This was, go ahead.
And this is in Jerusalem, outside the offices of the Jewish agency. So could very well be the exact same place he's describing.
Yes, excellent. So this is the sense of jubilation and just overwhelming simcha, overwhelming joy. And if we can go back now to this brief paragraph. Among the rings of dancers and merrymakers, not as though he was asking me, but as though he knew and was hammering in what he knew with nails. Just you look, my boy. Take a very good look, son. Take it all in, because you won't forget this night to your dying day. And you'll tell your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren about this night when we're long gone. I reached out sleepily to touch his face, just below his high forehead. And all of a sudden, instead of his glasses, my fingers met tears. Never in my life, before or after that night, not even when my mother died, did I see my father cry. And in fact, I didn't see him cry that night either. It was too dark. Only my left hand saw. Noam, if I could ask a favor just to see everybody's faces.
Yeah.
And sorry, thank you. I'm interested in knowing what, and you can feel free at this point to unmute yourselves. I mean, what did that evoke in you, that passage from Amos Oz?
Since he got choked up a little.
Yes.
I'm thinking of the return of the hostages on Sunday.
Ah.
And the joy, and yet in the background, somewhat of a, some are overjoyed at the return, and as am I, but it doesn't, we don't know what's going to happen going forward either. And it kind of, both those situations are like, there's this joy for this accomplishment, and yet there's more joy and perhaps sorrow to be felt as well.
Beautiful. Thank you. Anyone else? Judith, and then Sandra. Judith, you need to unmute yourself.
Of course. I'm thinking of the words grandchildren and great-grandchildren and personalizing it now. And I know my granddaughter is very involved with Israel and thinking about all this and affected by all this. But where are we going? Where will we be? Where will my great-grandchildren, what will their relationship to Israel will be, and what will Israel be?
Thank you. Sandra.
Well, I'm not sure now that I remember your question, what does it evoke in me? Because what I was raising my hand to say, what does that mean? How do I experience the reaction of the Father as opposed to what it evokes in me? And that that was to me, that makes me, I believe that he was feeling, and the tears were the expression of his sense of home, a place in the world and purpose for him and his soul, and that he had not, that was locked until that moment.
Ah, beautiful. It's very common now. You probably have heard the question asked, what is your why?
No, I never heard.
What is your why? What is your purpose? What is your raison d'être. It's a question in some ways that's based on a statement from Nietzsche, who wrote that once you know your why, you can always find a how. Once you know your why, you can always find a how. And when organizations or individuals, like if WRT is reviewing its vision or its mission, like why do we exist? Why do I exist? And in some ways, I think what Sandra has indicated, and I would wholeheartedly agree, in that little, I mean, the story, A Tale of Love and Darkness, is probably 600 or 700 pages, but for me, in many ways, it is encapsulated and is epitomized in that paragraph from which we read, when his father knew at that moment why he existed. As you said, he had not been at home. He couldn't. The idea that his hope had been somehow realized in that moment. And for me, I may be overreading here, the fact that he couldn't see it, because he said his eyes didn't see it. He felt it. He touched it. His hand saw it, as it were. That's another layer, I think, that, we have an eye, and then we have a mind's eye. And then in this particular case, we have the feeling of tears. And look, I know some of you reasonably well, but not well enough to know if you think of a time either that you have cried or someone who is near and dear to you has cried in a similar context, that was when they figured out who they were, or why they existed, or what their purpose was, or something of that nature. I know I feel blessed to have had those kind of experiences as a rabbi. Alan, do you want to say something about Amos Oz?
He spoke at Westchester Reformed Temple years ago. He was a guest lecturer. It was very moving, very bright, and I was just impressed that he could put words in a sequence that cut deep. I come up short after listening to someone like that.
No, that's beautifully expressed. And yes, both in person speaking as well as in writing, there is something just remarkably searing, penetrating, powerful, and memorable in his life. And there are this, in some ways, the book, A Tale of Love and Darkness, is a memoir to an extent. But it's not just his story, it's also our story. And one of the things that I was hoping to suggest is that, yes, we're a people. Yes, we're a religious community, but, and Joanne and several of you have going to personalize this, the Jews, to an extent, are still a family. And even the way we began, Achenu, Achiotenu, our brothers, our sisters, hopefully there is something that transcends the rational here. You may never have met any of the people whose pictures we saw, but yet somehow they leap off the page because we have some invisible lines of connection with them that are well nigh familiar. Deb.
I just wanted to share what it evoked for me. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was smuggled out of Russia to Argentina, to Buenos Aires. And that's where my father was born. And my father told me that when Israel became a country, it was the most important event in their community. And there was this just joyous feel that the smuggling could be over, that there was this sanctuary, and not that anybody wanted to rush off and go to Israel, but they had a place they could go and they could just move forward with their lives. And that's just always stayed with me.
Rabbi Katzew, you're muted.
Thank you. All right. That, in essence, is what we were hoping for, that we could be personal in this conversation and feel things that are much more intimate rather than necessarily ultimate, and recognize, yes, these documents and these events were global and had national implications and have longitudinal meanings over time, but they're also meant, I think, to be quite personal, and to bring Amos Oz, as it were, into the Zoom room was part of our hope and intention. So feel free, really, at any point, because in just a couple of moments I'm going to hand it over to Noam to continue, again, a very, I think, personal way. But you feel invited, just as several of you have already done, to share your personal connections and reflections, whether it's to Amos Oz or to the document that we read or to the particular statement. One other thing that I wanted to have us look at, if I need to find it in your passage, is something with respect to the demographics, to the populations that were Jewish and non-Jewish in the land of Israel, and how they related to the populations, that is, to these documents and to the responses of Great Britain, the Jews, and Arabs.
And let's put up the map for that. Actually, no, let's put up the map.
Fine, the map is
So
perfect.
let me just see Huawei. So do you want to do this or?
Yes, please go ahead. Begin, Noam.
So we talked about it a bit last week, but when we look at this map, the partition map, with the Arab side in yellow, the Arab state in yellow, the Jewish state in blue, what is there anything that strikes us about the way this is set up? Unless it's maybe differently. Why do you think these borders were decided the way they were?
Probably because of the people who are already living in those areas.
So populations, it's where those populations were, generally with an attempt to have as few Jewish Jewish civilians or Jewish people in the Arab state as a few Arab people in the Jewish state. So one of the things, for example, they did, it's very hard to see here, but right here inside the blue, you see there's a tiny bit of yellow. That's Jaffa. So which would have been an enclave of the Arab state in the middle of the Jewish state. And yes, we have all of these areas. Interestingly, a lot of the Jewish state is the desert. It's the Negev desert, including parts down here where no one was living at the time. Where this is where Eilat is today. No one was living there, Arab or Jew at the time. And and we said before, what would the Jews feel on seeing this map at the time?
I would think that they would think that they really didn't get as much land as they had hoped, and especially having Jerusalem as an international city and not belonging to the Jews, which is so central to our prayers at any rate.
And not just an international city, but an international city in the heart of the Arab state. And you really can't see it in this resolution. There is an international road that's supposed to lead to Jerusalem from the Jewish state, but it's clear that Arabs are going to have much better access to Jerusalem. What are the other problems for, we speak with the problems for Jews here?
Well, for one thing, go ahead.
I was going to say up north, it looks like the Jewish state is sort of cut in half by the
Yes.
over there. And for the Arabs, you think that they really don't have a contiguous piece of property either. The Gaza, you see that Gaza is just attached, just barely attached to the rest of the land there.
Yes, and there's also for the Jews, there's this area as well. And yes, Gaza is less attached. Over here, the Acre area, the Akko area, less attached. What this does mean is, if those two states live in peace, it's awkward at best. If there's a war, the Arabs could very easily cut off access between the Jewish states. The Jews can also cut off the area, but the Arabs will still have this large central area for them to control and defend, including Jerusalem, including support from the east by the new state of Jordan. So strategically, there's a problem for the Jews. Yet they were happy about it because they're getting a state. What is the Arab reaction?
It was the catastrophe.
Yeah. Catastrophe, what is that in Arabic?
Nakba.
Nakba. Yeah, it's a catastrophe because the way the Arab narrative works is this was a Muslim land. Jews arrived here from Europe. That's the Muslim narrative. Supported by the states, by the European states, by Western powers, and basically took half of the land. That is the way the Arab world has seen and still sees this moment.
Has any of you, I'm curious, read anything by someone named Rashid Khalidi? Well, the 100 Years' War is one of his books. You are obviously entitled to disagree with anything that I say, but it's my opinion that one of the things that some of us need to do is read narratives which are conflicting to our own and challenge us. And Rashid Khalidi, who is a professor, historian, and somebody who subscribes to a theory that has really taken over many academic institutions. It's called settler colonialism. And just as Noam was saying, that the narrative in this particular vein teaches that the Jews are newcomers. We are settlers. We have arrived only at the behest of the British, the French, and other colonial powers. And I again can't speak for anyone else, but in terms of Rashid Khalidi's work, there are many times that reading the book, I feel my temperature going up, and because I know things that are intentionally omitted, but nonetheless, I think it's really important for us, and not just Jews, quite frankly, but in a time of polarization, it's, I think, important to try to understand positions with which we disagree. And this map that Noam is elucidating can help us, I think, try to begin to understand perspectives that may not be our own.
And I gotta say, Rabbi Katzew recommended the book to me a few months ago, and I will confess that I tried reading it and I couldn't really get past the introduction without just having my inner monologue fight with the text, and I couldn't get through it. I think I will try again because I think it is important to understand, even in the terms of what the Mishnah in Tractate Avot says, "Da ma shetashiv le'epikos." Know what you would say to an apostate. So even in that regard, to just understand it on that level.
Sandra, I think, has a question or
Yeah.
comment.
You asked, what does the map look to me or us? It looks like a problem waiting to happen. From each person's point of view. I mean, just looking at the map, it doesn't, without having information that this is where more Palestinians live, and this is where more Jewish people live. It is broken up. It doesn't make logical sense physically, and I can relate to Palestinians thinking that the land was taken away from them by fiat, by Europeans. Not thinking, not on the other side, this is our land from the Torah and so on. But I just think it's really it's problematic, and it explains a lot why we have this conflict.
Yeah, that's true. One
The
small
Landaus, I think. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to, do you have a picture of a map after the initial war? After independence was
I
declared?
can bring one up. I don't have one ready, but I'm gonna bring
also, there were always Jews in the land of Israel.
Yeah.
I mean, from Roman times thereafter. I mean, the Muslims didn't exist until, 700, 800, 900? When
Yes, Islam, yes, in the 7th century. Yes,
right.
correct. But I mean, there were certainly Arabs there long before 700, but Islam and the Muslim population
Right.
wouldn't have existed prior to the 7th century of the Common Era. No question about that.
Right, but the analogy I sometimes give to my young students is they would have just recently learned about Native Americans in the secular school. And I would say, we know that there were Native Americans living even here where we lived. We know that they were driven away. We're not necessarily, especially as Jews, and most of us, well, I wasn't born here, but even I think most of you are more recent immigrants, or even your ancestors would not have been here when Native Americans were here. But if those Native Americans come back and say, well, this is our land, we deserve it now, we would resist it. And the same way that when the Jews came back to the land of Israel and said, this is our land, we were here before, we need to get it back, then the people who have at this point lived here for at least 1,500 years, or a little less, let's say 1,000 years, would naturally resist it as well. And that doesn't mean that we need to accept their point of view, but yeah, I'm gonna say, just because Jay asked about the post-war, so this is also later than the Declaration of Independence. This is the 1949 Armistice Line. This is what happened at the end of the war, with the new Jewish state Israel having all of these areas, more than obviously than in the partition plan. We have the West Bank, including half of Jerusalem, being under Jordanian control, under Jordan's control. It was, which is also still important to note. If this was a Palestinian state before, why wouldn't this be a Palestinian state now? Just this area? Well, it's not. That's not what anyone had a plan to. Jordan just took control of it. Jordan actually annexed the land. Nobody accepted the annexation except Israel, I believe, at some point recognized the annexation, and for whatever reason, Australia, if I'm not mistaken, recognized it. On the other hand, Gaza, the Gaza Strip, was under Egyptian control. They never annexed the land. And in fact, there's also indications that Egypt never really wanted that piece of land. One more thing is, you notice when they drew up these lines, they happened to use a green pen and to mark these areas. So to this day, this line is known as the green line. Okay. Yeah, and Baba, go ahead.
Sorry, my internet is a little shaky. Tell me if you can't hear me. I think that it goes back to the story, our Torah story of Ishmael and Isaac. In fact, in my class this week, I did Ishmael and Isaac, where God tells Hagar that your son is going to go in one direction, and Isaac is going to go in the opposite direction, and a great people are going to come from both sides. Now, explain to me, Rabbi, in the 35 years that I've been teaching religious school, why do you not see this story in any of the children's books? In each and every book that I've taught from, in each and every discussion that I've had with the children, no one knows the story. I think that if the story was explained to both sides, even though one side has taken over, Ishmael is taken over that he's the favored. Nobody explains this to the children, and I think that it's a real Chandra that nobody explains this to the children, and it's right there, right in our Torah.
So, Baba, you directed it to Rabbi Katzew, but I'm gonna say, as the person who's in charge of third grade at WRT, at the JLL, and that's specifically the time they learn these stories, I do want to say we do teach it. We use this book, which is the JPS Illustrated Children's Bible, and we do have in it the story of the birth of Ishmael. Okay. And when I unblur just for a second so you can see it, and you see here Abraham and Sarah in the backgrounds, the pregnant Hagar in the foreground. I don't know about anyone, but first of all, the person Ellen Frankel, who put together this children's Bible, chose to include this story. And yeah, it was important for us at JLL to tell the story, to talk about Jews and Arabs, to tell a little bit also of the Muslim version of the story, which is that Hagar and Ishmael got to Mecca, to where today is the I'm blanking on the name, but the main mosque in Mecca, where the Hajj, the pilgrim,
Kaaba.
Yes, right near the Kaaba. There are two hills that they said she ran through. There even in our version of the story, it says that Hagar found a well. So there is a well in Mecca that Muslim tradition is that well, and that Muslim pilgrims drink from that well to this day. But I agree with you, that is part of our story. And for me, again, being in charge of children that age, I'm trying to teach them to start seeing the world as complex.
Yes.
And start seeing our Torah as complex, not just in this national area, but even things like, Jacob is tricking his brother. Why is that the example we get?
No, we use Explorer's Bible,
Okay,
and there's no mention of it at all. If you can just name of
I can
the,
send.
of the book,
I can send. I have your email. I can send you the details if you want.
please.
But
I love, I just speak briefly. I love the fact that you raise these sorts of questions in the same way that, probably a generation ago when people were learning, and maybe some of you can verify this from or validate it from your own experience, that when we were learning American history, we learn about manifest destiny. There is a certain romanticization that over time has taken place of American history, of Jewish history, and we are now, in many ways, reaping what we've sown, in that there is an enormous backlash of students who went to Jewish day schools who are saying, you lied to me.
Yeah.
You haven't told me exactly what Noam said, how complex, how nuanced, how confusing and conflicting, and how there were always multiple narratives, and that it wasn't the case ever that in Jewish history we simply proceed. Yes, right. As I said, not only in Jewish education, it's all of us have a tendency to be biased in telling what our story is. And what has happened is we are only relatively recently learning what are some of the deficits in doing so, and having to, both with adults, having to backtrack. I can remember not long ago teaching about Hanukkah and having people our age say, you took my Hanukkah from me. I believed in the miracle. Da, da, da. Well, the rabbis made that up hundreds of years afterwards. It isn't just rabbis in the 21st century who make things up. The rabbis in every century make things up. And not just rabbis, you understand what I'm saying. And so to kind of counteract the romanticization, and that's precisely why I think Noam and I are trying to, in this course, take away the veil and make it messy, because we all know life is not this straight line progress. And so with respect to even now our youngest learners, we are no longer shielding people from the Shoah, no longer saying, bad things don't happen to good people, and thinking at some point in life that all of a sudden you're able to accept that. Now we are teaching more and more how complex not only Jewish education is and Israel education is, but in general, we have to recognize that in every story, there are going to be tragedies and triumphs, every personal story and every national story.
Yeah, and for that I will also say, for the "you lie to us" narrative, again, as from a perspective of an educator now in the field and in the Jewish Learning Lab, we have a limited time, unfortunately, with the students, both in the terms of the time of week they stay here, and also because the vast majority of our learners leave us after their bar or bat mitzvah. And that is an issue for us, both because there's a limit just the material we can get to, but also some of these issues are complex, and some of them are, the 13-year-old brain is not developed enough sometimes to really grasp the complexity. We do our best, and I think we're doing a good job in explaining as much as we can for their level. But in order to really understand it and to talk, and yes, to criticize and talk about some of the bad things and what we can do to help and how we can improve, we need to help to see them between the ages of 13 and when they go to college. So as a public service announcement, I think a lot of you here would have grandchildren, at least at that age. Please encourage them to come to our programs, to come to the table, or to come to one of the many other great synagogues and Jewish education places wherever they live, and we would love to have those conversations. And their parents, thank you, Joanne. And their parents at that age, I would, yeah, definitely. Okay. So
Shall
I
we go
think
to
we
the
can-
diary?
Yes, so let's go to Ben Gurion's diary, and actually that's, as a palate cleanser, first of all, I want to see what we're talking about in terms of the vote of 1947, November 29, 1947, the vote of the United Nations. And I had this file open just a second ago. Is it?
We can see it. It says 16th of Kislev.
Yeah, I know, no, but I'm looking for the video. Oh, there we go. So just to see how people saw it at the time, we have a video and audio from that day of what, and this is the way people in the land of Israel would have experienced the vote in the United Nations.
Egypt? No. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes. Yugoslavia? Abstain.
Resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
You can see some, there's no sound, but this is some of the dancing in the street we saw. Parades, this is all spontaneous. On that day, and that is the great joy that people are experiencing. But I'm gonna take a look at one of the main heroes of our story, one of the main protagonists. It's David Ben-Gurion. We're gonna see what he wrote in that diary that day. So we will have the actual picture from the diary on the right. You see 16th of Kislev, November 29, 1947, Saturday. The decision was made 33, 13, 10. 33 for, 13 against, 10 abstains. And that's all he really has. The closest thing to joy is going to express here, just saying the decision. And he immediately goes down to business. He has a to-do list. Government, constitution, name, justice system, capital, ports, budgets, airports, police, districts, broadcast, funds, armed forces, currency, services, anthem, and bureaucracy. So immediately starts thinking of what to do. And when we look at the image of David Ben-Gurion, he is a person of action. He's a person who immediately leaps into what needs to be done and what needs to be done his way. He was not generally a person that liked compromise. He was emphasized just dictating what he wanted to do. He wanted really to micromanage a lot of things. The next entry, which I didn't bring, the very next entry in his diary summarizes the vote, the vote for union, for the leadership of the union of print workers in Tel Aviv. And he breaks it down the same way. How many votes did his party get, Mapai? How many votes did the other parties get? So that's what's on his mind. Very much micromanaging, seeing, wanting things to be done right. And so when we read the Declaration of Independence, a lot of it is his doing. Even just the decision of whether or not to declare a Jewish state, which for us we seem obvious. The mandate is ending, we would declare a state. There was a large debate on whether this is the right time or not. At the time, Ben-Gurion was the one who eventually just dictated, we are going to have a state. And this is the way we do it. In an interview many years after this, he also spoke, like Amos Oz, of seeing the people dancing outside of the offices of the Jewish Agency. He said all he could think about was that we are about to have a war. He could not, and that he could not stop himself and could not make himself into any period of joy. Many years before this moment, he wrote one line in his journal saying, today at 4 p.m., I took Paula as my wife. That is his one line describing his wedding. When on the day of the Declaration of Independence, he similarly wrote, today at 4 p.m., I declared independence and read the Declaration of Independence. Then I went to meet with the chiefs of staff to decide to debate the state of the war. Again, not a lot of time for joy, a lot of time for emotions. But in Israeli Hebrew Yiddish would say tachlis, the essence. Let's just get through what we need to do. But with that in mind, we're gonna actually take a look at this part of the document. Is in a way about tachlis. We've stopped talking about why this is our right. Let's talk about what we're going to do. I've scrolled back to the beginning where we have a large portion of the text just to show one part. Until the establishment of the elected regular authorities of the state, in accordance with the Constitution, that shall be adopted by the elected Constituent Assembly no later than 1st of October 1948. So they're saying there's going to be a Constituent Assembly elected to write a constitution no later than the 4th of October 1948. Does anyone know when did Israel actually get its constitution? Yeah, never. We never got a constitution, and that's partly because of yet another compromise that the Ben-Gurion needed to make. There are basic laws that are supposed to eventually become a constitution, and it is a huge debate now. But I just want to see that because always strikes me that there's an actual date there, and which was never done. In their defense, by the time October 1st came around, we were still deep in war, and they couldn't have had an election. Okay, the election eventually came in March 1949. But that aside, we'd see one of the things that Israel would do. The state of Israel will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. So I want to hear suggestions. What was the vision of freedom, justice, and peace in the prophets of Israel?
Was there a lot of Israel?
So
Israel.
Yeah, they're saying based on
the vision
freedom,
of freedom, justice, and peace as envisioned by the prophets of Israel.
Yes.
That Amos that everyone's quoting from Martin Luther King's speech.
So I'm not sure who that was, but what's the quote from Amos?
Should we go on and say Martin Luther King?
King, it's Amos. But Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Heard it recently so many times.
Well, to me, it means that Israel would be a democracy and not a theocracy, which seems to be the way it's heading.
Yeah, a democracy. That is it. Some of the things around it is also, we're talking about equal rights to minorities. The law should be governed with no discrimination based on race, religion, or sex. That's in the Declaration of Independence. Yeah, that is absolutely true. It is, however, important to note that the word democracy does not appear in the Declaration of Independence. It did appear in some of the earlier drafts. It does not appear in the later. So, and some people would say, yes, because it's supposed to define democracy and you're not supposed to use the word when you define it. Some people would say it's because it wasn't supposed to be a democracy. And that is part of the debate of the judicial reform. These arguments have been made. But one of the things to see, and it's interesting you say that Israel will not be a theocracy. So it's interesting that they're basing it on the prophets of Israel. They also mention the Charter of the United Nations. They mention other important bases of rights, but there's also what the prophets of Israel at some of the basis for these rights. And let's take a look, for example, great quote from Micah, and what God requires of you only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk modestly with your God. That is something that the prophets do emphasize over and over again, justice and goodness. One other quality of the prophets is they speak truth to power. We have the story, for example, when Ahab caught sight of Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is that you traveler of Israel?" Elijah, of course, is a prophet who we remember from Passover. Ahab is the king of the northern kingdom of Israel in the Bible. So Ahab says to Elijah, "Is that you traveler of Israel?" Elijah retorted, "It is not I who have brought trouble on Israel, but you and your father's house, by forsaking the commandments of God and going after the Baalim." Another time, there is the famous quote from Elijah telling Ahab, "You cannot murder and inherit." And I brought here, just because I couldn't resist, the full chapter from Isaiah, which I will not fully read, but this is the chapter that is read in temple on the morning of Yom Kippur for the Haftarah. And the prophet Isaiah say, or God says to the prophet Isaiah, "Cry with full throat, without restraint, raise your voice like a ram's horn, declare to my people their transgression, and to the house of Jacob their sin." The prophet's job is to say, is to tell people what they're doing wrong initially, eventually. And also we have another common theme in the prophets, and again, that's also related to the idea of theocracy versus democracy. The prophets always de-emphasize the ritualistic aspect of religion. It's not whether you pray or whether you fast that matters, it's whether you do the right thing. So here we're talking about, Isaiah is speaking about the idea of fasting. Why, when we fasted, did you not see? When we start our bodies, you pay no heed? Isaiah is going to say, because you fast in strife and contention. You're not fasting the right way. What instead, this is the fast I desire, to unlock fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. It is to share your bread with the hungry. Fasting is not just, it's not that you don't eat, it's you give your food to somebody who needs it. To take the wretched poor into your home, when you see the naked and clothe them, to ignore your own king. To not ignore your own king. Again, the idea of the Jewish people as a family. So when we take this as a basis for what the state does, what would the state do to put these values into effect?
understand his question. What did the state do to do all
What should
this?
the state?
Oh, what
The
should?
idea, the quote from the Declaration of Independence is the state of Israel shall keep the values of justice, freedom, and peace as described by the prophets of Israel. So we're taking a look at some of the ways these are described in the prophets of Israel. And I think Isaiah is speaking here to an individual. Each one of us as individuals should pursue justice, should feed the hungry, should take off the coat of the yoke. But when we take this as the values of a state, what would we expect a state to do all of this?
I believe it says to pay attention to what we call the other.
$11:45. We've got another.
Yes.
Yeah, and if you can mute, unless you want to, and if you want to contribute, please mute yourselves. But so yeah, pay attention to the other.
I think Sandra had raised. Am I wrong?
But you're muted, Sandra.
You're muted. Yes. Ah.
You're still muted.
There you go.
Yeah.
Would you explain your question, please?
So I'm gonna maybe rephrase it as a thought rather than a question. We have here in the funding document, among other demands from what the state of Israel to do, the founders tell us the state of Israel will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, which we understand, but not just that, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. So they're telling us, follow what the prophet said. And one way we can read this is look at all of the emphasis on justice in the words of the prophet. We have a running theme. It is not the ritual. The prophets a lot of times speak against the temple, against the idea of worshiping in the temple, saying this is not what God wants. God does not want sacrifice of animals. God does not want the people to just gather there and in mock prayer. God wants justice. Yes, and Joe is raising his hand.
I think Alan hit the nail on the head with one word when he said others. I was thinking of that also. I was thinking that this is directing people not to be selfish, to have compassion and understanding for others, including those that they disagree with.
Is that what we, the people, was meant to be?
Yeah.
It's a mirror.
Definitely.
But I'm sort of borrowing it.
Yeah. So, and this is one aspect we see here. I would say, and again, there's been a huge debate before the war in Israel about how we lived up to these values. And there was a huge fight, and still is, about the state of the judiciary. And is it the judiciary's response to do something that the prophets would often do, and that is to rebuke the leaders? Or should the judiciary be more humbled and say that these leaders were the ones elected and should have more of a free reign? And the Declaration of Independence has been a part of that fight, and part of what we're pointing out. And I actually saw this as someone who has a liberal view of Judaism. Some debate online. Someone say, so you like this idea of freedom, justice, and peace by the prophets of Israel. What about Shabbat? And so another theme in.
I just wanted to add briefly, one of the things that may resonate is that for several generations, Reform Judaism really called itself prophetic Judaism.
Yeah.
That just as Noam is saying, we were going to be the ones who are going to emphasize ethics over ritual. We were going to be the ones who would hold each other, and in this case, the Jewish state, to live up to its moral ideals. And to an extent, I think this gives us, and not only us, license to say, wait a second, Israel, you are supposed to live up to freedom and justice, and here are ways you're not doing that. For example, and I'll just mention a couple, the way for generations and arguably even to this day, Ashkenazi Jews in Israel relate to Sephardi Jews in Israel. It isn't even just between Jews and Arabs or Jews and Palestinians. It is the case that there is significant inequity of opportunity, of wealth, of power, of political position, of influence socially in Israel, also between, quite frankly, men and women. So if Israel is going to live up to these ideals, it seems to me that the prophets are giving people today, whether it's Martin Luther King, who is drawing from the prophets, or rabbis who are drawing from the prophets. I'm thinking of some of the earliest sermons that I read from, say, Rabbi Stern at Westchester Reformed Temple. They were all related to the prophets. They were all speaking to the ethical core of Judaism. And so I guess I'm hoping, and I suspect also as Noam, that these issues of prophetic Judaism resonate with us and hopefully impel us to seek to hold Israel to live up to these values when we perceive that it is not doing so.
So Joanne is commenting, it's interesting that Reform Judaism didn't support Israel's creation if the state was to be inspired by prophetic Judaism that was supported by Reform Judaism, which is an excellent comment. I would say by the time Israel was founded, Reform Judaism did moderate its stance, by which I mean there was still people who were very much against the idea of Zionism, but there was also a lot of Reform Jews who were for a state at that point. But at least initially, the initial view of prophetic Judaism as Reform Judaism saw it is that we're not supposed, because we are prophets, because we're supposed to be prophets, we're not supposed to just confine ourselves to one space. We're supposed to be spread around the world and carry out this message. So at least initially, the Reform movement saw the idea of Zionism as antithetical to prophetic Judaism. Yeah, Joanne.
I was just going to say that in the 1960s, as I was growing up and going to religious school at a very Reformed congregation, I remember the rabbis specifically saying, and maybe it was because I was young and I understood it the way, a 10-year-old understood it, don't go to Israel. Israel doesn't like Reform Jews. There's no reason for it. It was decades before that congregation even brought Jews to Israel. In fact, probably not till the 2000s. But anyway, I just have that seared in my memory that Reform Jews don't go to Israel. Reform Jews don't support Israel. And yet, if the Declaration of Independence was so for prophetic Jews, or had seeds of prophetic Judaism planted, that the Reform rabbis of my childhood were so against Israel.
As some of you undoubtedly are aware, there were in the Reform movement when it was growing extremely quickly in the decade or decade and a half after the founding of the State of Israel, many of the synagogues that were founded were called and are called Temple Israel because they are breakoffs from other Reform congregations in which rabbis espoused, and not only rabbis and others and leaders espoused exactly the position that Joanne is citing, that we aren't interested in Israel. And there were political reasons, there were religious reasons, lots of different types of justifications. But as Noam mentioned, the Reform movement as a movement had moved away from its position in 1885, and by 1937 was already accepting of an Israel, maybe not for American Jews, but for Jews who needed shelter, etc. And then already by the 70s, and in particular by the end of the 20th century, the Reform movement's even official positions, it's the first time that there are documents written with Hebrew words in it, and it's also the first time that it becomes full-throated liberal Zionism, if you will, that is espoused in the Reform movement. But it's taken well over a century to arrive at that place.
And one sort of historic remnant of that is, so Rabbi Katzew, you mentioned that you retired from HUC recently, right? But actually, we call it HUC, but the full name is HUC JIR. Right? So it's Hebrew.
Yes. Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion.
Institute of Religion, right. So in the, I think, was it early 20th century? Rabbi Stephen Wise, Rabbi Stephen Wise founded in New York City an alternative to HUC called the Jewish Institute of Religion. And part of his disagreement with HUC was around the topics of Zionism and political Judaism. So that was the Zionist wing of the Reform movement, was around JIR in New York City. Eventually, sometime in, I think in the 1950s, the two institutions finally merged. And what was the Jewish Institute of Religion is now the New York campus of HUC-JIR. So this is around this time that the Reform movement is completing this rethinking of itself. Yeah, but I'm gonna show, though, even in prophetic Judaism, there are parts that might appeal less to us today. And I'm quoting again from the prophet Micah. Thus said God, guard yourself for your own sake, against carrying burdens on the Sabbath day, bringing them through the gates of Jerusalem. Nor shall you carry out burdens from your houses on the Sabbath day, nor do any work, but you shall hallow the Sabbath day as I command your ancestors. But they would not listen or turn their ear. They stiffened their necks and would not pay heed or accept discipline. And this is also the emphasis on Shabbat, on Sabbath, is very strong in the prophets. And there are social elements to the idea of Sabbath as well. But here we're not seeing a social element. We're seeing a very practical element being emphasized by the prophet. Do not carry burdens on Shabbat. Do not do labor yourself. So this is an anti-liberal idea here. You do not have permission to work on Shabbat, even if you want to. So some would say, if we really want this principles of freedom as envisaged by the prophets, it would mean a state that keeps Shabbat, where work on Shabbat, where restaurants would not be open on Shabbat, where Jews and non-Jews alike would not work on Shabbat, because that's also the law of the Torah, that people who are not Jewish but living in the Jewish land should not work on Shabbat. Of course, there's no public transportation on Shabbat. Of course, there's no, maybe it's debatable on whether we would go into individuals' life, whether they want to keep Shabbat or not, but that is an aspect here. and some of the debates we've been having is you can't pick and choose when you talk about the prophets or you talk about the Torah. What gives you the authority to pick and choose that this part about justice is good, this part about Shabbat is not? And another aspect, so we mentioned, and you mentioned the idea of the other. How do you treat the other? That's definitely something in the prophets. They talk about take care of the stranger amongst you, take care of the widow, the orphan. But how do the prophets feel about different religions? So let's take a look at the prophet Elijah again.
Well, I think Joanne raised her hand.
Oh yeah, Joanne, go ahead.
I'm just thinking that if the prophets were committed to this idea of one God, they probably weren't so much in favor of any other religion. But I don't know. I haven't studied the prophets enough.
Yeah. No, that is true. And from the same chapter I quoted before of Ahab talking to the prophet Elijah talking to the king of Israel and telling him, you are the one who is disturbing Israel. Same chapter, he's criticizing him for worshiping the Baal, the Canaanite god. And there is this scene where he says, let's do a matchup. Let's go up to Mount Carmel, near Haifa today. And it's going to be me, one prophet of God, versus 400 of the prophets of Baal. And in it, Elijah approached all the people and said, how long will you keep hopping between two opinions? If the eternal is God, then follow the eternal. If Baal, follow Baal. But the people answered him not a word. And the people he's talking to are Jewish. And what he's saying is, you, Jewish people living in the kingdom of Israel, some of you have been worshiping God and the Baal, and you cannot do that. You need to choose. And I'm skipping the whole story because there's a miracle of, you can call it that. Elijah and the prophets of the Baal are competing to see who will create the biggest prophets, the biggest miracle. Elijah wins, and then Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal, let not a single one of them get away. They seized them, and Elijah took them down to the Wadi Kishon, to the river of Kishon, which is near there, and slaughtered them there. Killed 400 prophets of the Baal on one day. And by the way, that is the person we are inviting into our homes every Passover.
Judith?
There's such an extreme difference between the Declaration of Independence of the United States and this Declaration of Independence of Israel. The United States had an enemy, their allegiance to the king, and they were separating themselves from that. The Declaration of Israel was it a theocracy from the beginning? Because it is founded on the foundation applies to what the prophets have said. It's biblical. It's tied to the Bible as opposed to declaring its independence from something else. It's declaring its existence as a nation. It's very different.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. And definitely, even though some parts of the Israeli declaration were inspired, such as we do have a declaration of rights as well. And towards the end, there is a trust in higher power, just like the Declaration of Independence ends with the aid of Almighty God. But yeah, there is definitely a difference there. But for these sections, what we're trying to show is, first of all, we have a tension here in the Declaration of Independence between universal values and particular values. This is a state that's supposed to be modern, yes, democratic, have rights for all, but yes, it is based on the right of one particular nation. And this is a tension that we'll need to keep looking for. Some on the Israeli front would say, okay, they will not be for executing different, people who follow other religions, but would say, yeah, yes, no, if we want to be by the vision of the prophets, that means Judaism has its place in the public sphere and other religions do not. This came about very recently after the IDF took control of the Hermon mountain, right next to Syria. Some of them found at some place there a cross being laid on the tallest mountain of Hermon. And they started calling that spot, the soldiers among themselves started referring to that spot as Yeshu, Jesus. That's the name of that spot, which started off as a joke, but then some soldiers got really mad that we're guarding this place that has a cross on it, and it was spread on social media. Some people on social media were also saying, why are we as a Jewish state, keeping this cross up? And at some point, some soldiers took it upon themselves to remove that cross. Later on, their commanders intervened and put it back. But if we really so much the vision of the prophets, part of it is, yes, remove idol worship. So that is our tension.
Joe?
Joe,
you need to unmute. Yes.
Question about the second paragraph. They seized the prophets and let not a single one out. They didn't get away. They took them down to, I don't know what Wadi Kishon is, and slaughtered them. What happened to the commandment, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not kill?
I think you answered the wrong question. Sorry, Rabbi Katzew, do you want to say something?
Oh, that's all right. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there is a difference between murder and kill. That is the main, I would say, that I'm trying to say from this perspective here of the Bible, right? Not necessarily what I agree with, but not all killing is murder.
Yes.
So killing in war is not murder. Killing in self-defense is not murder. And execution, which is part of the law of the Torah, is not murder. So I think the Bible would see it as a rightful execution. Now, I do say I want to bring this part just as for the extreme version of it. There is later God does rebuke Elijah as in this sin and in other sins going too far. And there is some of the tradition is that the reason that Elijah keeps coming to us every Passover and also for every bris is not as a reward for him, but sort of more as an educational experience. Look at how we can do it more easily.
May I suggest that we, just for the last minute here, if we can just have everybody's
Yes.
faces? What I hope has emerged is actually something that reminds me of a poem by Yehuda Amichai, who was sort of the poet laureate in the prior generation for Israel. And if you haven't read any of his poetry, much of it is accessible in English. It's magnificent and compelling and cogent. And one of his poems speaks about how every one of us censors the Bible, and every one of us lives, and his words I'm translating now, lives censored lives. So when we're looking at a document like the Declaration of Independence, some people will read the text that we looked at about justice and freedom and kindness as that's what we mean by prophetic Judaism. That is what we should emphasize. That's what we should hold up with respect to Israel. And other people will say, oh, prophetic Judaism, that's the one that says we need to get rid of anybody who doesn't agree with our position with respect to who God is. And we need to have the maximum amount of land, and this is all ours, and God gave it to us. That's why, since the birth of the state of Israel, and quite frankly, since the birth of the Jewish people, you know, that old joke about 2 Jews, 3 opinions, all that, that's no joke. That's why there are so many coalitions or so many parties in the government, and you end up becoming bedfellows, as it were, if you want to be in power with people who have fundamentally different perspectives on a document like the Declaration of Independence. So we can look at it and say, oh, prophetic Judaism, we're into that. We love that. Who's going to be against morality and against ethics and against kindness and against compassion? Nobody, I suspect, of us. And I don't know that anybody would be against love, for example, but it's also those same prophets. Oh, they say things that we don't agree with, like if you don't keep Shabbat, you're dead. If you don't agree with our perspective on God, you can leave. You can be exiled. So one of the things that we hope is emerging here is recognizing that just as you study the Talmud, just as you study the Bible, you can look at a document that was basically largely written by Ben-Gurion in 1948 from multiple perspectives that conflict with one another depending upon what narrative you come and bring to it. And you know, for Noam and for me, I hope it's somewhat for you as well. It's both maddening and a lot of fun to be able to look at a document that is a living document and try to make sense of it and make meaning of it for us. I know I went over time. I apologize. But we will conclude next week, and don't expect that we're all going to, you know, come to some nice, neat bow and all of us will agree. But hopefully it'll be worth both the struggle and the joy. Hope everybody has a good week, and we have more hostages released between now and when we see one another.
Yeah, so I will say I did put up the source sheet again, so if you want to look at it on your own and also see the many texts that we didn't get to, you're welcome to take a look. And we're also happy to continue and have a conversation. At least I am.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much, all of you. Have a sweet Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.